This is part one of a series called The History of Thanksgiving. So, in part one, we're going to talk about what was going on in North America prior to the arrival of the Mayflower in order to better set the scene of that 1620-1621 interaction between the Wampanoag and those Englishmen who arrived on the Mayflower. Firstly, in 1492, the population of North America wasn't quite known. There are a large debate and range on estimates, but right now, the land that was north of Mexico, which would include the United States and Canada, had between 2 to 18 million individuals. Now, to put that in perspective, England was at about 3.6 million in the year 1500. France was 15.5, Spain 8.5 million. One of the reasons why that is important is regardless of the range and the unknown factor, archaeological digs, as well as documents by English, French, and Spanish fishermen, note that there were large population centers within North America. In addition, there was a dense population on the East Coast. That's important because one of the misconceptions about early interactions between Europeans and Native Americans is that Europeans were coming to an untouched wilderness in which Native Americans barely inhabited or barely worked into the environment. That's not necessarily true with agricultural practices and the population centers and trade networks. It was a human interaction that was changing or changed the landscape. And part of that change is what allowed Europeans to take a foothold. That's largely due to what's coming up in a few slides. As far as interactions, 1620 with the Pilgrims is nowhere near the first interaction in the eastern coast of the modern United States. Giovanni da Verrazzano was an Italian who was paid by the French. He's documented in some of his journals to have said that the East Coast was densely populated as he sailed from North Carolina up to Rhode Island. There were also about 200 British fishing vessels by the year 1610, or 10 years before the Mayflower comes across the Atlantic Ocean. Samuel de Champlain, who's a Frenchman, tries to settle near modern-day Cape Cod in 1605, but left because of the dense population. And one of the reasons why is that with trade, Native Americans on the East Coast often would allow English and French and Spanish fishermen to come ashore, but that was to conduct trade, to smoke fish before returning to Europe. The idea, there are many accounts of local Native Americans allowing short stays, but then in one way or another making it clear that Europeans were to remove themselves from the land and return back to where they came, only to come again for future trade. However, disease took forth. We know that Europeans brought smallpox, measles, hepatitis, and influenza, and because of a lack of exposure to those diseases by Native Americans, and now there's also research by Francis Black that argues that HLAs, or human leukocyte antigens, were not as diverse in South American natives, and that very narrow HLA profile could have left them susceptible to particular diseases. In this case, it could have been some like smallpox and measles and hepatitis. And so the combination of a narrow quantity of HLAs as well as lack of exposure meant that the immunity rates were quite poor, and 90 to 96% death rates happened in New England in 1617. Now, there are documented cases of viral outbreak all throughout North America and South America with the European arrivals, and those documents often come from European journals. To put the death rate in New England in perspective, the Black Death that took place in Europe killed between 30 to 60% of Europeans. And so what ends up happening is villages in this New England area are abandoned as of 1617 through 1620. Now, to show the landscape of this region, so modern-day Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, you have the Wampanoag, who are going to be the major players in regards to the story of the first Thanksgiving. Just west of them are the Narragansett. They are arch rivals, often fighting for resources and trade. The Wampanoag often use their position on the coastland, especially in the 16 and 1500s, to dominate or act as a middleman with trade between Europeans and inland. Now, before we can get into any kind of story about that first Thanksgiving, we have to give a lot of background on a person called Tisquantum. He is known as Squanto and therefore part of the folklore. In fact, the Disney made a movie or tried to make a movie about Squanto. Firstly, he is from the village of Patuxet, and was trained to kind of act as a bodyguard to the Sachem, or that's a term for chief. Now, Tisquantum is defined as the phrase rage of the deity Manitou, or it could be translated into wrath of God. This name is derived from when he was enslaved by the Wampanoag more so than from his birthright. John Smith, as in like the John Smith from Virginia, the whole Pocahontas story, visited Pawtuxet in 1614. He left one of his lieutenants, Thomas Hunt, in charge. Thomas Hunt, against the wishes of John Smith, captures Squanto and others from Pawtuxet, taking them potentially into slavery across the Atlantic. He tries to sell them in Spain. One of the parts about Spain is Pope Paul III had declared that Indians should not be enslaved. So Spanish priests actually seize Squanto and several others. And eventually Tisquantum is able to escape to England, where he is taken under the wing of John Slaney, who kind of, it's not quite an enslavement, but sees him almost as a person that is of interest. And so Squanto learns English. Eventually, that shipbuilder, John Slaney, helps Squanto find his way to Thomas Dermer, who helps Squanto return to North America. However, when Dermer goes with him, they end up sailing down the East Coast, and when they get to the New England area from which Squanto originated, they travel inland, and Tisquantum actually encounters Massasoit, who informs him that 1617 plague had wiped out Pawtuxet and that village is now abandoned. Squanto returns to Maine with Dermer. Dermer, with some poor choices, decides not to settle again, sails back down the coast. Squanto, at this time, goes away from him and decides to walk, and ends up getting captured by Wampanoag, who turn him over to Massasoit, and Tisquantum becomes this distrusted, almost slave to Massasoit, and partially distrusted because he was working with the English, and there had already been some attacks in this time period, and then also because he was a man without a home because of the enslavement and the travel that he had gone through. So that's the background that leads us up into 1620 and 1621, which is the time period in which the Mayflower is about to arrive.